And now to Carlo. There are 5 reasons, by the way, that I am pleased to introduce Carlo to you this evening. One is he's one of the young lions of the Boston College faculty, without whom, frankly, I wouldn't have stayed at BC. They have changed Boston College for the best, and I am very pleased to serve them, frankly, as an administrator, and also to serve them up to readers of Boston College Magazine. Secondly, while studying for his doctorate at Yale in American Studies, Carlo frequented bars in which my brother, who was also a doctoral student at Yale, played drums in a rock band. The rock band failed, and my brother is a young lion at another university, and Carlo is here, and I think has given up drinking for the duration. So I have a personal connection to him that goes back to Yale. And frankly, while many faculty, almost all faculty, can write well and can write in a scholarly fashion, Carlo is one of those rare faculty who can do both at the same time. And no matter how esoteric his pursuits, he never stops trying to tell a story, which is why his work is beloved of that great magazine, The American Scholar, and why he has been anthologized in Best American Essays, and why he publishes in other great magazines like Harper's. I should also say, reason number 4 is that I've prevailed on both my children, who were students at BC, to take Carlo's course, and both have found themselves advantaged by my recommendation and have been able to tell me so, which is a rare thing between young adults and their father. Finally, I want to say I read this book and was very appreciative of the piece I'm going to read right now, Carlo's dedication to his wife, Tina Klein. I will read this because it's lovely and because I want to do a gloss on it. The book is dedicated to Tina Klein, possibly the finest natural flyweight ever to come out of Huron Village. Because 1, she would get seriously bent out of shape if it were not. 2, I have been carried along on the surge of her inspirational thinking, editorial rigor, and encouragement. And 3, she taught me a secret about curiosity. Exploring the world around you and taking an interest in what people do can be a form of gratitude. I'd like to say in the case of Carlo's writing, it's also a form of blessing. The things he writes about, the people he writes about, he ennobles, even as he tells the truth. He respects everything. And that's a great advantage for a writer and a human being. I'm pleased to ask him to come up here and speak. Please make him welcome.
Thank you, Ben, for all 5, especially number 2. And thanks all for coming out, especially those of you who have already had an hour and 15 minutes of me today. That's above and beyond the call of duty. I'm going to talk for a while, and then I'm going to read for a while. And I thought it would make sense to talk about the practical matter of writing the book rather than supposed to spend most of my time trying to summarize the whole book in 40 minutes. The way I'm going to do this is I'm going to set up the problem of writing the conclusion and then read that conclusion, which starts in a snowstorm in Buffalo and ends up at the fights in Atlantic City. Now, reading the conclusion is sort of a risk since I can't expect you to be familiar with the rest of the book that comes before the conclusion. But I figured that with a few minutes of talking, I can at least sketch out some of the ideas that drive the book and introduce the main subject matter and introduce the main characters, so you'll have a rough sense of who and what I'm talking about, enough to feel oriented when I read the conclusion. Now, the point of taking the risk is to talk about a question of approach that was on my mind when I was writing the book, which was to try to find a style of written argument that would be equally at home and also equally not quite at home in a scholarly journal or a literary quarterly or a monthly or a weekly magazine, all of which I read and all of which I admire and all of which I write for. I think of analyzing a novel for a quarterly or covering a fight for a weekly magazine or considering the meanings of electric blues for a literary quarterly as all part of one job. They all entail thinking interpretively about how an event or how an artifact means. And in that sense, the scholars on the board of a journal, crabby as they may be, and the editors of a newspaper's Sunday magazine, as interested in selling ad copy as they might be, want to know the same thing, which is what's the bigger story. How do you read that bigger story encoded in the details of the case at hand? And at what point does this story touch our sense and touch our reader's sense of what matters? Furthermore, both groups are interested in the relationship between the interpretation of form and the social grounding of form, between what an event or artifact can say to people and how it got to be that way. Now, even if these shared concerns do bridge the gaps between magazines and quarterlies and everything in between, each of those types of publication has its own peculiar tradition of thinking and of writing. And each of those peculiar traditions of thinking and writing have led to particular house styles. That is, ways of writing characteristic of this kind of magazine or this kind of journal. And I'm a big believer in paying attention to house style. Institutions and genres, and the genres based in certain institutions, are the most important vessels into which we pour our inspirations. They help give shape to inspirations and make them coherent. And that's part of what the book is about. It's about how blues clubs and boxing gyms and branches of city government and other institutions leave their imprints on even the most personal art forms, the most personal practices, and how we can trace the material connection of style to a city by connecting a style to an institution and then the institution to the city's landscape. So I wanted to find a way to engage the house styles of different sorts of publications in which I've encountered useful and interesting and even beautiful writing about culture. So I hope to make something syncretic, an approach, and maybe more important, a language to match that was at once a hybrid of traditions and, at least in theory, an original invention. Ideally, excerpts of the book would be at home in all the various kinds of publication, although the book as a whole wouldn't be exactly at home in any of them. Now that makes it sound like I'm claiming much, much more for this book than I am, and there's nothing unique about what I wanted to do. There's all sorts of writers working this territory of stylistic overlap and coming up with their own syntheses. But the point is, the matter of how to write the book became clearest to me when it was time to write the conclusion, to sum up both the form and the content of what I was saying. So that's what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the conclusion and how it got to be that way. So I'll proceed in 3 steps. First, I'll set up the book's argument in general terms. Then I'll lay out the specifics of the problem of writing a conclusion for that kind of book. And then I'm going to read the conclusion, and then there'll be time for some questions and answers afterward. So step 1 is to tell you in the broadest possible terms what the book is about. I'm going to go fast here. Had you been reading along in the book and arrived at the beginning of the conclusion, you would have been reading a book about boxing, blues, crime stories, and the remaking of the landscapes and the public life of mill cities in which the mills have stopped milling. All these forms of culture, blues and boxing and crime stories, design and the landscape, have histories deeply intertwined, not only symbolically but materially, with the history of work in America, and particularly with industrial work, which once upon a time meant factory work in cities above all else. As American cities have changed, and especially as cities once arranged around the business of turning raw materials into manufactured goods have become centers for services and other non-industrial work, forms of culture rooted in those cities have registered and responded to those changes. So I wanted to show by profiling some individual makers of culture, people who make culture with their hands, and locating them in the fabric of city life, how a set of big, interrelated, structural, impersonal changes in work and in play and in urbanism over the last half century have registered in a variety of city-rooted cultural forms. Now, another and simpler way of saying this is I wanted to write about truth and beauty in the Rust Belt, which is for me the most evocative and most affecting of regions. None of the forms I discuss is exclusively native to the old manufacturing capitals, the Midwest and the Northeast, but they all flourish there with special vigor. To my eye and to my ear, Chicago-style electric blues, or a club fight in Erie, or a movie like The French Connection is ripe to bursting with Rust Belt aesthetics and history, and I wanted to make that case. I think of Rust Belt as a heroic and maybe even a poetic term rather than a pejorative one. Like most belt usages, it probably owes its origin to Bible Belt, which may have originated as a term of contempt, but becomes something else when it's used by those whose way of life and whose region it describes. To my ear, Rust Belt has the right ring of machined metal and weather. It resonates with hard use, also disuse and reuse. It sounds like the right name for a region in which you can always find your way to the railroad tracks or the old working waterfront. Somewhere in town there will be a district of large, solid brick buildings that once gave conventional form to labor, to the ideas of labor and capital. And somewhere nearby will be stretches of workers' housing, arranged tightly and neatly as if they've been packed for a long voyage. You know where you are in the Rust Belt, whether you're in a mid-sized city like Erie or Brockton, in the once paradigmatic industrial city of Chicago, or even in New York, which, let's not forget, once upon a time was, and in some ways still is, a great manufacturing city. You know where you are even though or because the landscape has changed. The factory buildings and warehouses may have been shuttered or converted into loft apartments or offices. Perhaps a brew pub has moved in. When I interviewed the mayor of Brockton, Jack Units, he said, "We need one of those," talking about his depressed downtown. The workers' housing, too, may have been gut rehabbed or just gutted, made to age with more or less grace. The aging of industrial urbanism in the Rust Belt and its partial collapse into history and its partial supersession by other kinds of city life forms the general backdrop of all the local stories that I tell in this book. But they're stories about art, or at least about craft. They're not stories about working on the line in a factory, even though I argue that the two things are related. So tracing the history of work in fights and songs and movies and the landscape itself, I took my cue in part from the blues writer Robert Palmer, who once asked rhetorically, how much history can be transmitted by pressure on a guitar string? I asked that exact question in Chapter 2 on Chicago blues and try to offer some answers that update Palmer's. My answers have to do with the transformation of Chicago from a factory city into a service city, especially a tourist city. And with two great migrations of the late 20th century that Palmer's story of migration from Africa to rural South to urban North doesn't address. My great migrations in Chapter 2 are the movement of the blues business from the black South Side to the white North Side of Chicago in the 1960s, and the migration of formal emphasis from singing to guitar playing that happened at the same time. So all the chapters in the book similarly connect material accounts to stylistic histories. A classical American studies approach, once summarized by Tom Wolfe as the study of form plus money. And they do that as they try to answer questions like what kinds of history, what kinds of meaning move within the form of a well-thrown punch, or a guitar solo, or a movie chase filmed with a handheld camera, or a landscape of factories and workers' housing that's been transformed into an open-air museum. Each chapter follows one or two characters and locates them in a particular cultural practice and in a particular city. So here's most of what you need to know about the 4 chapters in order to follow the conclusion. Try to get all the names in there and everything so you know who I'm talking about when I get there. Chapter 1 is about boxing, especially women's boxing in Erie, Pennsylvania. Its main character, a doctoral student in psychology named Liz McGonigal, is one of the pioneers of women's boxing, who've picked their way through the partially collapsed ruins of the old edifice of masculinity in places like Erie, industrial cities where being good with your hands on the job and at play used to be the center of working class life. She's trying to salvage from that ruined tradition a set of virtues once associated with being good with one's hands. But she has to reckon with the fact that those virtues are connected to things she doesn't want to reclaim, including and especially a tradition of thinking that any conjunction of women and violence always equals pornography, no matter how skilled the women might be in that violence. The men who work on the line at Erie's big General Electric plant cheer rabidly for Liz McGonigal as a reincarnation of their grandfather's masculinity. But they also howl for her as if she was jello wrestling. Like all my characters, she's trespassing onto this sort of shifting cultural ground, and she's navigating between the persistence of the old and the succession of something new. Chapter 2 is about Chicago blues. Its main character is the guitar hero and club owner, Buddy Guy. That's the two of them on the cover of the book, Liz McGonigal and Buddy Guy. And as I just said a couple minutes ago, Chapter 2 tracks the movement of the blues business to the Loop and to the North Side during the city's post-industrial transformation. Guy's guitar playing, which gestures back to Muddy Waters and company, but also gestures to all the rock guitar heroes who learned from him, and his very profitable downtown club, which thrives on the tourist trade, are in the middle of a very messy and often very ugly and pointless debate about the relative blackness and whiteness and Chicago-ness of Chicago blues these days. And one of the things I propose is that that's also a debate about what Chicago is good for, now that it's not good for making things anymore. Chapter 3 is about crime movies made in New York in the 1970s. Its main characters are two cops, Sonny Grasso, who was known as Cloudy, and Eddie Egan, known as Popeye, who helped break the big French Connection heroin case in the early 60s, and then crossed over into Hollywood in the 1970s after working on the movie that was loosely based on the case. This chapter examines how a bizarre, it is a very bizarre, alliance of movie people, cops, crooks, and government officials work together to create a new kind of documentary-influenced movie style to tell stories about the post-industrial city. And it's about how two hard-handed guys from the old neighborhood with high school educations, two guys partially cut adrift from old New York and only partially adjusted to the emergent city, got in on the action. Chapter 4 is about competing attempts to redesign the mill city of Brockton, Massachusetts, now that its shoe factories have almost all closed down. The two main characters are an internationally prominent landscape artist named Patricia Johansson and a pit bull fancying janitor named Mark Cazzieri. Patricia Johansson was brought in by the city to give Brockton a makeover, but her employers, after first welcoming her to town, basically turned on her later. They were expecting the usual, a nice river walk, maybe a brew pub, some new light standards downtown, and instead she gave them a plan that sort of radically rethought the city and unearthed and tried to treat all the social and all the environmental traumas that had been produced in the last century and a half of industrial history. So she wasn't allowed to finish what she'd started. But Mark Cazzieri, the pit bull fancying janitor, a highly motivated guy from Brockton who loves his hometown, was inspired by the central element of her plan, which was to turn a modest little frame house on Dover Street into a Rocky Marciano museum that celebrates the industrial working class and its way of life. So Mark Cazzieri bought the Marciano house from Patricia Johansson, and he's still at work on it right now. Actually, he's working the night shift at the post office right now, but he's still at work on it during the days, restoring it with his own hands, despite interference from all sides and the occasional telephone threat or break-in. Half a century after Rocky Marciano used to be welcomed home to Brockton after a fight by crowds of 100,000 on Main Street, that is equal to the population of the city. Some people in Brockton still get exercised about him. And what I try to show in the chapter is they get exercised about him because Rocky Marciano has been freighted in public discourse with the whole heaping burden of what's been gained and what's been lost in the long, slow aging out of industrial Brockton. So, now you've read the book. And on the strength of that haiku-like outline, just fill in all the evidence, and there you have it. So let's pretend you read the book and you've come to page 230 and you're ready to read the conclusion. I've told my stories and I've made my points. You'll have to trust me on that one. And now moving to step 2, how to conclude the book without reiterating everything I just spent 230 pages saying as well as I could. To my mind, in conclusion writing, some of you heard this just recently. To my mind, in conclusion writing, there are 2 poles to navigate between. One pole toward which scholars tend to steer is to reiterate all your main points again as forcefully as you can while suggesting the widest possible application of them. At its best, this produces an extremely clear book, and that can be useful, especially to fellow scholars who want to get right to the meat of the argument and move on. Grad students preparing for their exams refer to a book with this sort of conclusion as a good orals book. You can skim it fast and come away full. At its worst, this say-it-all-again, only faster and simpler approach involves a high-end book-scale version of a habit I try to discourage in undergraduate paper writing, a habit that has been made much worse by the computer, which is the routine of copying all your topic sentences from the paper and pasting them together into a paragraph at the end, then rewording them so they're not identical with the initial statements. Usually they're worse. And then finally framing this Frankenstein's monster paragraph with suitably conclusionish phrases like, thus we see, or my favorite, throughout all time, man has striven to comprehend, whatever it is you're talking about. Now, at its worst, this kind of conclusion is almost not worth reading. It's always worth reading, but almost not worth. The other pole in conclusion writing, toward which many literary agents and editors, especially commercial presses, are always trying to push writers, is to set out to do it all with narrative and character. An agent's ideal conclusion to even a scholarly book like this one would involve a fist fight, a car chase, and a panty scene that somehow capture the essence of the author's point and can be employed by the press's marketing people when pitching the book to Barnes & Noble and to radio talk shows. Now, that's overstating the case. And furthermore, the thing not to lose sight of is this kind of conclusion, although it's pretty bad when it's bad, is also pretty great when it's good. Argument by pure description, if you can pull it off, is an underrated triumph of expository writing in which you describe something in such a way that the reader can only come to the conclusion that you want the reader to come to. And I should add that I'm not exactly the third pig in the brick cottage in this matter. Without any pressure from an agent or an editor, I seem to have included in Good With Their Hands several fistfights, a couple of car chases, and discussions of pornographic traditions that are potentially pleasing to men and women of various sexual preferences. But even with all this latent, and it's basically latent agent catnip in it, Good With Their Hands is still at heart a book organized by an analytical premise that you can read a complex history of city life in all sorts of cultural forms if you know how to look and you know how to listen. Even if I wanted to, and I don't want to, I don't think I could deliver a purely narrative or character-based conclusion that would do justice to that analytical intent and that analytical premise. So like a lot of other writers faced with a similar problem, I tried to come up with an approach that was, as I said before, part hybrid and part invention. Steering by one conclusion writing pole, I wanted to write an analytically satisfying ending to the book's argument. That means you show the reader the ground you've covered, your main themes, you touch on every chapter. A satisfying conclusion can also offer ways to open out the argument so that your reader, now that he or she has read the book, can apply it more broadly to all the other things to which your argument applies you didn't have time or space in the book to apply them to. Here's where telling a story with characters in it and arguing by description, that is, steering by the other conclusion writing pole, works best. Narrative and character are still the best tools for exploring the human consequences of the play of ideas and for turning yourself, and especially your reader, into characters who are thinking along the same lines. I wanted my conclusion to give the reader a sense of passing swiftly through a very thickly layered landscape and culture of post-industrial America, experiencing it not only with me but also for himself or for herself. The fond hope of the conclusion is that now that the reader's seen what I'm seeing, we can go for a drive into Buffalo, we can go visit the fights in Erie, we can listen to some music in Chicago and watch New York-made crime stories on TV together and take a walk through a mill town and a casino and finally down the boardwalk in Atlantic City. And as we go, together and separately, we can taste the post-industrial flavor of life in the Rust Belt. A subtle flavor that might have been only half perceived or perceived but unidentified before you read the book. Anyway, that's the fond hope of the conclusion. And then finally, I wanted to end up back at the fights, which is where I was when I got the idea for the book in the first place. So, with that said, I will read you the conclusion, see how it came out. As I said, it begins in a snowstorm in Buffalo, and it ends at the fights in Atlantic City. The conclusion's entitled Getting There. Once on the way to Erie from Boston to see a cart of fights, I got caught in a December storm on I-90. I'd been driving faster and faster, trying to make time before encountering the lake-effect snow prophesied by voices on the radio. Just before I reached Buffalo, though, I entered without preamble into a heavy snowfall. Big flakes blew hard out of the west, sailing on the wind like leaves and hitting my car with wet little thuds. Traffic slowed, ragged columns of cars crawling and sliding in the accumulating snow. Checking the rearview mirror for tailgaters and other potential menaces, I saw the car behind me, a Talon, which was coming on too fast, suddenly skid, swerve to the right, then overcorrect to the left, and spin out, crashing solidly into a concrete abutment off the highway's left shoulder. The car sat for a moment like a fighter taking a count, then backed up a few feet, spun its wheels as it got underway going forward, and fishtailed back onto the road again. Its right front end had been staved in, and a piece of metal hung crookedly off to the side. The driver, foolish, pig-headed, in shock, or determined to get right back on the horse that threw him, stepped on the gas and passed me, disappearing into the late afternoon gloom at an unwise speed. A few minutes later, I passed the damaged Talon. It was on the shoulder, no doubt having spun out again. But its driver was angling to slip back into traffic and try his luck again. I did not see the Talon after that, though I checked my rearview mirror from time to time, worried. The car's travails and resilience had seemed like a Rust Belt portent of some kind. The radio contributed to the afternoon's portentous feel. On a Christian talk station, somebody told a story about a Chicago couple who ran over a piece of metal in the road, igniting a freakish car fire that killed 6 of their 9 children. But the point was, they still believe that God is sufficient. The big subject on Christian radio that afternoon, as is so often the case, was the book of Revelation. The horned beast, the opening of multiple seals, and other elements of the coded arrival of the end of days inspire creatively dire applications to the contemporary world. The horned beast is Iraq. No, it's North Korea. No, it's the World Bank, or the British royal family, or Hillary Clinton. On a sports talk station, a host who calls himself the coach was leading callers in heaping abuse on Marv Levy, the aging, unfailingly decent, highly competent coach of the Buffalo Bills, who were 6-8 at the time after reaching but losing the Super Bowl repeatedly in the not-too-distant past. Everyone agreed that Levy was too old and that it would be selfish of him to stay on. Callers had only bad things to say about Todd Collins, the team's quarterback, too. The worst QB in the NFC ever, according to one caller, heartily endorsed by the coach. The discussion evolved into a macro-historical debate over whether the rise and fall of football teams' fortunes is natural. Callers variously endorsed the notion of a structurally inevitable decline after a golden age, and the notion that incompetent or perhaps even malign individuals like Levy and Collins were responsible for ruining a perfectly good team. Nobody suggested that Levy and Collins might individually or collectively be the horned beast, but they were clearly handmaidens of doom. Later, on an Erie station, Mr. Fletcher explained that shadowy conspirators were manipulating the climate, as freak storms in Malaysia and the Dakotas clearly proved. He cited corroborative facts from the Iron Mountain Report, a notorious hoax, actually, and suggested the conspirators' identities in an excursus on North Korea's heroic resistance against the New World Order and its black helicopters. A caller confirming Mr. Fletcher's linkage of bad weather to darker forces marshaled on the world historical scale by a train of villains stretching from the Illuminati to the Trilateral Commission, reported that his research shows that we're being controlled in ways most of us can neither understand nor resist. There is a particularly ominous buzz in the air on this kind of afternoon in the upper Midwest and Northeast. The overcast sky seems heavy with more than snow. The way ahead seems occluded by more than slush and evening's early arrival. It seemed to me that the people on the radio felt it too as they talked of end times and current events, golden age and decline, bad weather, dark forces, crashing and burning. When this particular order of entropic chill native to the Rust Belt starts to get to me, I want to be in somebody else's kitchen, or a bar, a bookstore, a pool hall, a gym, a place where it's warm and there's company. Instead, I was trying to get to Erie in time to watch some fights and perhaps have a follow-up chat with Liz McGonigal if she showed up after all on what promised to be a bad night for going anywhere. It had something to do with an article I planned to write, which had something to do with a book I wanted to write. And at that moment, it all seemed like a feebly insubstantial reason to be sliding all over the road so far from home. I was approaching an industrial city on a gray day, which is normally my idea of a good time. But even the most familiar sort of place can feel thin and cold, for want of better words, on this kind of afternoon. There's nothing like work to warm and thicken the world right back up again. I did have a book to write, at least in theory, and on a Buffalo talk station I found a lay seminar on form and meaning in the Rust Belt that had me wishing I could risk pulling over to take notes. I had both hands on the wheel, removing one from time to time, only to find another radio station. When I got to Erie, I wrote down everything I could remember. A host and his guest, a city councilman, were encouraging callers to suggest solutions to the problem of what to do with the Memorial Auditorium, known as the Aud, on Main Street in downtown Buffalo. For more than half a century, it had been the city's principal arena, home to the Buffalo Sabres hockey team, and the site of concerts, circuses, and political rallies. But it had been rendered obsolete by the opening of the new Marine Midland Arena. The vacant Odd, boarded up in 1996 and regularly abused by graffitists since then, now housed pigeons and bats. Everybody in town seems to have voiced an opinion about what to do with the Odd. Some have urged its demolition. Others have suggested turning it into a military or architectural or maritime or historical or children's museum, a convention center, a cultural center, an entertainment complex, an aquarium, an intermodal transit hub, a sports superstore, a film production studio, a giant indoor parking lot. Callers that day had a narrower range of options in mind. Turning the Odd into a casino headed the list. One caller suggested that we get an Indian tribe in here right away. Then, when it's legal, we can have the state take over. Others advocated refitting the Odd as a prison. The building is literally bomb-proof, one of them pointed out. The host and his guest rejected this option, not because it would be an evil, cretinous thing to do to a public gathering place on Main Street, but because it would be bad for tourism. On the other hand, a prison might be turned into a strong draw, as the talk radio crew might have realized had they considered the success of the cable television show Oz, which had completed its first season and already made a name for itself as hard-hitting drama by showing eager viewers the spectacularly awful things that can happen in prison. An ant farm prison in the Odd, with glass walls and guaranteed violence, might well draw visitors in droves on their way to and from Niagara Falls. Attracting tourists, the hosts agreed, was the given in this discussion. The caller who proposed turning the Odd into a golf driving range got a hearing because, after all, tourists do like to play golf. They were talking about what to do with industrial Buffalo, the transport hub that attracted immigrants from Europe, migrants from the South, steel mills, grain elevators, the auto industry, the Pan American Exposition of 1901, and an honor roll of major architects who designed important buildings there. H.H. Richardson, McKim, Mead and White, Louis Sullivan and Dankmar Adler, Frank Lloyd Wright, Eliel and Eero Saarinen. That city boomed in the 19th century, but the development of the St. Lawrence Seaway in the 1950s and the steel industry's contraction in the 1970s marked the middle and late stages of its passing. The Odd, a Great Depression-era project approved by FDR, was built relatively late in Buffalo's high industrial heyday, but it occupied a site with a longer history. It stood near what was the Erie Canal's western terminus, on the edge of one of the city's oldest sections, a stretch of waterfront that bore the marks of 19th century urbanism in its cobblestones, docking slips, and railroad infrastructure. Quote, "The wealth that built the mansions on Delaware Avenue and our classic downtown buildings had its source in and around these 12 acres," end quote, wrote Don Esmond in the Buffalo News in 2000, urging his fellow citizens not to allow any more demolition or redevelopment in the vicinity of the Odd. And Esmond goes on, "Experts say we have a historic cultural landscape, a physical record that can be used to tell the evolving story of a key site in American history. This is our Alamo, our Fort Sumter. The cobblestone streets and commercial slip and 1880s concrete railroad bridge tell the story of the canal trade and how it was later displaced by railroads," end quote. Esmond pointed out that cultural tourism was booming across America. Philadelphia even includes the pit where Ben Franklin emptied his chamber pot on its historical trail. And he hoped that Buffalo would have the good sense to create a heritage park to exploit and preserve its history. Something had to be done because, as Don Esmond reminded his readers, Buffalo's desperate for any economic boost. The usual signs and portents told the story: a moribund downtown, an exodus of young people, a shift to a service economy anchored by health care and banking that had yet to pay off, a municipal reputation reduced to the banal stigma of Snow City, USA. South of Buffalo, the going got worse, then better. Despite the weather delay, I made it just in time for the fights, which were held before an excitable crowd in the ballroom of the Avalon Hotel in downtown Erie. It turned out to be an evening of well-contested bouts between competent regional tough guys. Johnny Bizarro, a technically accomplished local welterweight who developed a tendency to fight a bit too far from his opponent, lost the featured attraction to a persistent ham and egger from Cleveland named Henry Hughes. The class of the evening's field was Paul Spadafora, a lightweight out of Pittsburgh who beat a guy from Buffalo named Roger Brown in the preceding bout. Spadafora got hit with some hard punches, but he had the makings of a champion and later became one. He had classically elegant footwork and defensive form. He controlled his opponent's aggression by turning him in the clinches and taking a walk to reset the range when pressed. He had terrific hand speed and a gift for body punching, and he mixed his punches with an artist's touch. Sputifora made curious ush-ush sounds when he threw punches, as if speaking the secret names of the various blows. The ring girls had the look of seasoned pros in the exotic dance trade. One of them, who went straight back through the ropes with a limber dip and step motion rather than the usual bend and wriggle, distinguished herself by doing a handspring in high heels. After the fights were over, having had my chat with Liz McGonigal, who was looking forward to her next bout and thinking about applying to MIT's doctoral program in philosophy, I walked up State Street to Perry Square, where I'd heard a blues band in a bar on a previous visit. It had stopped snowing, and the temperature had dropped. The wind came straight down State Street off the lake, sculpting snowdrifts and frozen slush into shapes one used to see on the covers of paperback science fiction novels. I found the bar, which appeared to have exactly the same people in it who'd been there the last time 9 months before. They were even wearing the same sweaters. The blues was recorded rather than live this night, but the room was cozy, and I found a spot along the rail to hoist one in peace. I'd found my way to the fights, blues, the close atmosphere of a bar on State Street on a cold, windy night, expressions of the ordinary and extraordinary ways in which work and play, that is life, accrue to a complex thickness in places like Erie, Pennsylvania. I had found my way through the landscape to some truth and beauty, Rust Belt style. I did the same thing when I walked through the Trump Marina to hear Buddy Guy play, and I do the same thing when I go out to hear live blues in Chicago, whether headed to the Checkerboard, on the South Side, Legends downtown, or a North Side club like Blues. You must negotiate accrued layers of social, economic, and cultural history to get to the music. And often enough, once you get there, you find yourself mentally peeling back some of the accrued layers of musical form and performance in which that history has wrapped the music, has wrapped the blues. The guitar-heavy mix, the crowd that wants to hear Sweet Home Chicago again and roars at the mention of the Rolling Stones or Stevie Ray Vaughan, and the 27th request to let me hear you say, hell yeah, and the audience happy to oblige. You can peel back those layers, but you cannot dispense with them. The movements of people and capital and ideas that produce those layers also condition the form of the music and your experience of it. How you get through the landscape to the music is not separate from the music itself. Each is part of the other. You can stretch the point to include what happens when, flipping through the channels, you come upon Popeye and Cloudy at work, or Shaft, or Priest, chasing someone down the street in the grainy twilight of early 1970s cinematography. You have to negotiate many layers of electronic landscape, everything showing on all the other channels, the noise and smoke of advertising, the standardized plot and stock characters of the movie itself. But you can find your way to the inner city after the urban crisis and to a moment at the start of the 1970s when the histories of city life and popular storytelling converged in a burst of stylistic creativity. The latter-day context in which you see a movie from that moment shapes the meanings you derive from it. Conversely, the movie and its moment influenced what came after, as evidenced by the action movie on one channel, the 1970s nostalgia rap video on another, the panic-stricken local news report on another, the shaky cam reality show on another, the rerun of Hill Street Blues or Homicide or NYPD Blue or Law and Order or a Grasso-Jacobson production on another. So again, the electronic landscape through which you travel and the world of the movie in which you finally arrive contain and condition one another. The layering of history and meaning in the landscape produces the satisfying thickness that makes you feel you are somewhere. But it also produces tensions. The strong feelings motivating Patricia Johansson's and Mark Casieri's efforts to create a Rocky Marciano museum in the house at 168 Dover Street in Brockton, and the strong feelings inspired in others by that project, attest to the potency of the meanings layered into the landscape. The struggles touched off by those efforts suggest how much can be at stake in determining the proper relation of past to future in a changing city. Imagine for a moment that both the dream of a Marciano museum and the mayor's plans for downtown Brockton are realized. Picture arriving at the Marciano house after stopping downtown to stroll along the riverway, check out the stores and other new businesses housed in converted industrial buildings, and visit a red brick brew pub or coffee house. How would you put together the experience of the museum and the downtown? A history of Brockton inheres in the relationship between them, a tangle of stories fraught with strong feelings about what's been gained and lost in the city's long transformation. As a monument to a particular fraction of the industrial working class, the Marciano Museum would be both of a piece with the converted downtown and in some ways a refutation of it. You would expect to feel such tensions in Brockton, a quintessential gritty city in which you always feel that you are somewhere. It is perhaps more surprising to feel them even when you walk through a casino, a place designed to help you imagine yourself nowhere, outside of time and unconnected to the workaday social landscape. I walk through casinos frequently because, except for a few big bouts held at Madison Square Garden and similar venues, the upper end of the boxing business has largely migrated from the industrial cities that once served as fight capitals to gambling centers such as Las Vegas, Atlantic City, and Foxwoods. Even the prospective return of marquee bouts to old-school fight capitals like Detroit has been pegged to the establishment of legalized gambling in casinos. Boxing attracts players by generating excitement and television exposure, which is good for the gambling business, and it also allows a casino to offer a sort of triumphalist history lesson in suitably spectacular form. A performance under glass by antediluvians who work hard with their bodies and live by principles of self-denial. Casino culture affects to regard boxers in the same way it regards racehorses, as magnificent atavisms to be celebrated and patronized, survivals of an era remotely antecedent to our current golden age of leisure and gaming, when people rode horses to get around and worked with their bodies to pay the bills. This conceit gestures back to the emergence of modern pugilism in late 18th century England, when aristocratic swells mixed with fist fighters, bear baiters, touts, gin vendors, and others of low station to shape Regency sporting life. Contemporary casinos offer Americans, especially those of the working class and middle class, who make up gambling's principal customer base, a chance to play act at being swells. The juxtaposition of boxing with gambling reinforces casino patrons' sense of swellness by offering them the spectacle of low types toiling, half-naked boxers fighting, half-naked women dancing and waiting tables, liveried servitors dealing cards, and so on. But the presence of boxing in a casino also signifies against the grain of playing at leisure class idleness. The fights, after all, offer an account of the history and meaning of the body at work. Leisure and luck, which are supposed to matter most in a casino, are heretical notions in the fight world. Work and skill, the key words of boxing, might mean something to the casino employees who deal the cards or provide entertainment or bounce the unruly, but not to the overwhelming majority of gamblers who lose their hard-earned money on unlikely bets and go home hysterically satisfied. Almost everything about a casino's self-presentation, other than boxing, has been designed to make a visitor forget about work. You're intended to feel as if the money in your pocket has been magically devalued, made into something filthy to be shed as fast as possible by the fact that you earned it. What you need to do is launder that tainted money by cycling it through slot machines or by turning it into chips, gaming with them, and then cashing them in for better money that has been magically supervalued because you won it through lucky play. When you walk into a casino, especially the large sections of it, dominated by cacophonous banks of slot machines, you enter a parody of a factory straight out of modern times or Metropolis, an atrium filled with machines feverishly tended by people who make repetitive motions for hours at a stretch. But nobody who gambles in a casino has to be good with his or her hands, and nothing is produced other than profit and loss. I think part of the meaning and perhaps the attraction of boxing for casino patrons lies exactly in the reminder it offers of work, limits, material consequences, and other subjects rendered taboo or exotic by the logic of institutionalized gaming. I've always been reminded of this uneasy relationship between boxing and one of its chief patrons of the post-industrial age. Television is the other. When I attend a fight at the Boardwalk Hall, the old convention center in Atlantic City. The building's facade, a modest sweep of arched stone, bracketed and dwarfed by the steel and glass box of the now defunct Trump World's Fair on one side and the two-tone tower of the Trump Plaza on the other, has a headstone quality accentuated by the legend inscribed on it. And the legend reads, "A permanent monument conceived as a tribute to the ideals of Atlantic City, built by its citizens and dedicated to recreation, social progress, and industrial achievements." Like the figure of the citizen from whom power proceeds to duly elected officials, the notion of industrial achievements has become an archaic and indeed a subversive principle in a city comprehensively refashioned according to the logic of the gambling business. A brittle crust of promise and amusement stretching over a deep, dark sea of bad luck, bad jobs, and odds prohibitively stacked in the house's favor. Whatever the inscribers of the convention center's facade meant by social progress has been redefined as a matter of moving up from the $5 minimum blackjack tables to the $10 tables. People visit Atlantic City because it's a place synonymous with goofing off and with action. Yet very few people come to Atlantic City anymore to swim, sunbathe, breathe ocean air, move among crowds on the boardwalk, or otherwise engage in recreation, as it used to be defined when the city functioned as a Riviera for the urban villages of New York and Philadelphia. Those crowds are for the most part indoors, hunched over slot machines and tables, ignoring one another while sweating bullets in the de-skilled pursuit of leisure. Atlantic City's principal economic achievement has always been separating visitors from their hard-earned money. The gambling industry's innovative contribution to civic ideology has been to encourage a kind of contemptuous blindness to work that makes industry a dirty word. But when you pass under the old convention center's inscribed facade and find your way to ringside, you encounter two boxers, good with their hands, applying themselves to a problem that luck and leisure can never help solve. The ring occupies a landscape alive with meaning and with convergent stories, but the combatants are not symbols, and they are not history. They are working. Thanks. Should I do my own calling?
You can do your own call. I think your experience in the class taught you how to take questions.
Right. Even the bushwhack people who don't raise their hands.
Yeah, exactly. Could I start out?
You.
You clearly weren't raised in an industrial ghetto. And I'm wondering, what is it about these places that draws you so tremendously, that causes you to spend all this time looking at what happened?
That's a fine question. I wasn't. I was raised in a. I was raised in a first house neighborhood on the south side of Chicago. That kind of neighborhood in which families buy their first house, live there 10 years, and move on. But the railroad tracks that came through there were the Illinois Central. That's the train you took from Mississippi, and the train that went to the east side, which was one of the world's biggest concentrations of heavy industry. And then if you went the other way, it would go to the stockyards. I was born in 1964. I came of age in a moment when all that stuff was starting to fall apart, and so those were my Greek and Roman ruins. Really, was sort of industrial Chicago. You could actually walk to the tracks, and walking along the tracks, find your way to an older city that was sort of poking up through the city that was taking shape around me. So I guess that was part of the attraction, is that it felt thick, and sort of the visual signs of thickness for me are brick architecture and smokestacks and neighborhood parish churches and the old architecture you can trace, the saloon, the gym, the Union Hall, and that's the world that most recently preceded the world in which I grew up. So that's the first layer of what has always been history, for me at least. Plus, I've lived my entire life in the Rust Belt, and that's what we got. Oh, right, maybe the arrow goes the other way. I've lived my entire life in the Rust Belt because I refused to leave, right? Suzanne, go ahead.
Can you tell the story of getting the idea for the book? Because you said you were sitting in a fight when you got the idea.
Oh, that's right. I forgot to repeat your question. Suzanne asked where I got the idea, the story of how I got the idea to write the book, which I got at the fights, as I mentioned. When I had my first academic job at Lafayette College, I was looking for things to do in the Lehigh Valley of Pennsylvania. And among the not limitless things to do, many but not limitless things to do, was to go see the Golden Gloves fights at Liberty High School in Bethlehem. So I went, and there was one women's bout, and it was Liz McGonigal against a woman named Sarah Kump. And so all the fighters that day were from, the sort of honor roll of industrial towns: Mechanicsburg, Altoona, Hanover, Easton, Bethlehem, Allentown, you name it, Pittsburgh. And it was at that moment that the last steel had been made in Bethlehem. The rolling plants were cold for the first time since the Civil War, since before the Civil War. And I was just thinking, here's all these men coming out of the traditional the sort of a tradition that says you're good with your hands in the ring and you're good with your hands at work, and that work is drying up. And then there was this women's bout, and everyone in the gym just went nuts. And it was a very complicated reaction. They were sort of cheering for them, and they were also kind of hooting and whistling. And you know, I remember this guy sitting next to me with his family, like yelling at the top of his lungs, like, "Those ladies can really scrap, buddy," you know. But then there was another guy sitting over there, kept holding up a dollar bill and saying, "Come get your money, baby," you know, to the ring girls. And so I was just sort of looking. Everyone just lost it for this fight. And you know, a amateur fight's only 3 rounds. You know, it's over quickly. I think the women's bout, they only let them fight 2-minute rounds. And I was just sort of looking around and thinking, okay, how did these women find their way to boxing, and why? What are the layers of this incredible reaction to them? And I think that's sort of the moment when I said, you know, this is what I do when I'm supposedly not working, but this is, you know, this feels like what's most interesting to me. And the other advantage of writing about Chicago blues is I could then activate 20 years of quote-unquote research, you know, misspent time in blues clubs. And it's like suddenly that was all good, right, because that was useful. Rhonda, go ahead.
I'm interested in the ways you talk about meaning blues music in particular, because I think about, it randomly comes up in my class about rap lyrics and rap music and what it's supposed to mean and how it's supposed to represent certain communities and certain, I guess, historical moments. And I always ask the question, what do record companies do to influence that meaning or reshape the meaning? And I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on how blues music has gone through or has not gone through a certain kind of deformation of meaning.
Mm-hmm.
And it gets published or produced in certain ways. And if that meaning then is part of the definition of cities, does that work in with your meaning of blues, or is it something wholly different?
Okay. Short version of that question, which I'll repeat, is a question about blues and how you just tell me to add whatever I need to add here. But is there a kind of a deformation of the meaning of blues as the social situation in which it's made, and especially the financial situation in which it's made, changes? Is that right? Close enough?
Yeah, and sort of the influence of the record companies.
And the influence of record companies. Well, you know, like everything in this book, there's a standard story about how that goes, which is it's all bad, right? That blues used to be good and now it's bad. And there's plenty of people in Chicago to tell that story. And what I was interested in is exactly that there are all these new institutions for making blues, that in the 50s and in the early 60s there was a set of institutions that had been created by black migrants from the South and immigrants from Europe, like the Chess brothers, who were Polish Jews. And that those institutions had allowed the creation of a certain kind of blues world. And there was a certain style associated with that, a certain way of playing. I kind of stay more away from lyrics and think more about musical style. And that's now considered the golden age of Chicago blues. And that world began to fall apart for lots of reasons, not just urban reasons. But one of the reasons that world began to fall apart is because the black metropolis that those migrants from the South made was taken apart in the 1960s, and starting in the late 50s, but especially in the 60s, by urban renewal, by the sort of slowing down of black migration, then eventually reversing. So there's this sort of, and one of the things that happened was the small business sector of the old black metropolis was gutted. So, you look at 43rd Street in Chicago, that used to be a booming commercial strip, and then when I was going to the Checkerboard Lounge, which is on 43rd Street when I was a teenager, there were just, check cashing joints and a couple storefront churches, and there were the Robert Taylor homes, on the horizon, and you could see what had happened, right? So what happened in the 60s and 70s, and then finally solidifying in the 80s and 90s, is that there was a whole new set of blues institutions that were on the north side, and their clientele were overwhelmingly male, white, college-educated baby boomers who came to blues through rock and through folk, right? And that has stylistic effects on the music. So the standard story is blues now bad, right? And what I find interesting about Buddy Guy is that his problem with the old school, the golden age, was that they wouldn't let him play 30-chorus guitar solos and make a lot of noise and use feedback and everything, because people like Muddy Waters and Willie Dixon and Leonard Chess would stop him. They'd say, that's noise. And so he was liberated to play in a way he always wanted to play by the transformation of the city and the way you do. And so that's a story about style. And then the way you make that a story about his material connection to the city is he used to own a club on 43rd Street in what's now called Bronzeville, and He lost that club in the 80s and opened a club downtown, which is a booming business. He has 45 employees. He's planning to build his own building a block away. He owns the rights to his own music, all in part because he makes music that rock-trained audiences want to hear. That's neither a decline story nor a booster story, although it's got elements of both in it. And so I was attracted to that kind of story, that people have set explanations for that. And I was attracted to what's not in those set explanations, which is, look, it's a Chicago story, and the city changed at the same time. And it's not just that I associate his style symbolically with industrial and post-industrial Chicago. He actually invested his money in one kind of institution and then another. And yeah, blues clubs and record companies influence the way music is made. But if you ask Buddy Guy, he'll say, I always wanted to play like this, and they wouldn't let me. And other people might say, well, that's what made it better music before, is that he kind of rattled the bars of the orthodoxy and made really interesting music by pressing up against it. Now nobody stops him, and he can play 25-minute guitar solos, which some people find oppressive. But those are the kind of stories I like. They're stories about style that are also stories about, how much rent was in these two clubs, what a lease cost and a liquor license, and why this neighborhood was a good place to do business and why that one was. And each of those chapters has that kind of, connection. But yeah, I try to stay away from lyrics, because that's sort of, that's what English professors have traditionally done in music, is make it words, and that's not primarily, Chicago blues is really about singing, but it's not necessarily about lyrics, looking for every factory. I'm trying to find all the industrial lyrics. It's easy to do, but that wouldn't necessarily be making the argument. Go ahead.
Well, I think you sort of touched on this, so I hope my question's not repetitive. But I think boxing is is a pretty fascinating sport, because it's so visceral and aggressive, and it's so primal. I think, particularly women's boxing, because it's sort of novel and new. So I was wondering what it is about. Like, it seems like the smaller industrial cities like Hanover or Brockton that you're mentioning, it sort of inspires boxing as its sport. And what's changed in the city that's made women's boxing come to dominate the field, or at least dominate our interest in the field?
Or at least mine. So there's a question about how boxing comes out of these smaller industrial cities, and especially women's boxing. Well, again, part of it is institutional. That those cities, cities like Erie had a lot of boxing gyms in them. And it was because there were a lot of men in town whose the center of their cultural life was being good with their hands, and so a lot of blood sport, hunting, fighting, and working in factories. And so part of it is institutional, that why does any individual person take it up? Partly because there's something inside them that involves, that he or she has an appetite for hitting. But a lot of it is opportunity, that appetite can be poured into the vessel offered by an institution, which is the boxing gym on the corner. By the time I got to Erie in 1997, I started visiting, there were just 2 gyms left. And someone like Liz McGonigal, to come to the second part of your question, what interested me about her, she was raised in the suburbs. And she had to find her way. And not only was she raised in the suburbs, she was raised in a family where the parents had worked on the line in factories, but the father had become management. They'd moved to the suburbs. The kids were all sort of credentialing themselves and moving up and out. And she actually had to take a detour back through the old neighborhood to find a boxing gym to satisfy this kind of desire. She had tried running and lifting weights and doing karate, and it wasn't scratching that itch. So she had to find her way back into the what's left of the industrial city, to find the one institution, this gym, the Lower East Side Boxing Club, where she could get instruction. And I found that really interesting, because she was after a set of virtues that are traditionally associated with boxing, autonomy, self-sufficiency, all those kinds of things. But on her way to getting a PhD in psychology and, moving up and out in the world. So that's why women's boxing is particularly appealing to me, is that there's an older tradition that encourages young people to go into boxing, but there's now this kind of vacuum. There's not enough young men interested in doing this, and now there's these women, often middle class or upper middle class women, who are sort of taking advantage of that vacuum in the institutions to move in. And now, last time I was there were several women, mostly high school girls, training at the gym, and she was sort of a figure in town of what was possible. Go ahead.
I was wondering how you came to the decision about what you wanted to do in the bad chapter, or I guess another question would be, is there anything you wanted to talk about that you couldn't go out in the room? What made you think that decision to talk about this
So why talk about these particular chapters was the question. And part of that is just serendipity. Someone told me about Patricia Johansson and the trouble she was having in Brockton. The answer to chapter 4 is my wife got a job at MIT. And I needed to go on leave from my job at Lafayette. So we came up here to Boston, and I started looking around for a job here, but I was on leave for a while. And I was looking for a 4th chapter that would be about an industrial town that was arriving at the post-industrial crossroads late. And Easton, where I had lived in Pennsylvania, had arrived pretty late. But they already had arrived. They make crayons in Easton. Those of you who've seen the name before, it's because Crayola is there. Vinnie and Smith is a company that makes Crayola crayons. Now they have the crayon factory downtown, which is always mobbed with kindergarten classes on field trips, and they're selling the idea of crayonness, instead of making crayons. So Easton was already too late, And then I started finding out more about Brockton, which was just arriving at the post-industrial crossroads in its culture, just arriving at the moment where people, and even in the Chamber of Commerce, were looking at each other and saying, okay, being good with our hands and shoes and Rocky Marciano is not going to cut it. That's not going to attract internet companies to Brockton, right? So it was a perfect city for what I wanted. And a lot of the chapters have similar stories. I was going to the Checkerboard Lounge when I was 13 years old. So if I'm going to write about a bluesman, it's going to be that one because Buddy Guy owned it, right? It's where I happened to go when I was in high school. So. And Liz McGonigal, I went to the fights one day in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and this amazing thing happened, and I wanted to investigate it. So each of the chapters, it's really it's a book about looking around where you live and thinking about the landscape you move in, and that includes the electronic and the cultural landscape. But it's not like I had this master plan that these are the 4 most important things. There's trajectories within that. There's the first chapter is about really an individual kind of reviving an older industrial culture. By the time you get to the last chapter, it's the city government trying to do it. And it becomes official that this is what needs to happen. We need to do something with our industrial history. So there's sort of a trajectory, too, from kind of individual ad hoc attempts to navigate this to official, cities deciding our future depends on navigating between the industrial and post-industrial. Okay. Right there in the back. Thanks for the warning. Yes.
Where do you think the Rust Belt is going? Where do you think these characters are going? And where do you think the culture being good with your hands is going?
Boy, that's a good question. I will not do justice to it in repeating it, but it's a question about the layering of history in the book and about sort of casting, if you can cast our minds forward for 10 years and think about what future layers will accrue. Since it is a book, it's written in the present, but it's mostly looking backward, as you say, right? And I hate to predict, which, I'm always the only writer at ringside when I cover a fight who does not predict what's going to happen in the fight. I don't regard that as, challenging or interesting, right? But I think in this case it is. And I think part of the answer is that the answer to the question, what do you think is going to happen in the future, really depends on where you are in the Rust Belt. I mean, there are cities like Pittsburgh that confronted this question a generation ago. And there are cities like Brockton that just got there recently. So part of the answer is it's not like there's this monolithic. The layering is not monolithic in the Rust Belt. It's different from place to place. I think what's increasingly going to make it tricky is that city governments and private industry, service industries, are increasingly getting into the business of packaging the history of cities and selling it and reselling it. And so more and more the task of excavating layers of history is also going to be working your way through layers of marketing that have been, including, changing the landscape. So, for instance, cities like Chicago have really invested in the idea of ethnic villages. You know, they want to, as they say, Hellenize Greek town, you know, and Italianize Italian town. And the old neighborhood where the checkerboard lounge is, there's now plans to turn it into a blues strip and have it be, you know, Bronzeville once more, the Black Metropolis once more. So if you're coming along, if some of these plans reach fruition, what you're excavating is not just the creation of cultures caused by folk migrations and migrations of money and all that, but also the intervention increasingly of institutions like government to create landscapes that sell history to visitors in the same way that, you know, putting in trolleys downtown, saving and renovating old industrial buildings. So it's increasingly the history, I think, of that, the history of preservation. And I think that makes it a lot trickier in a lot of ways. And also, you know, it makes it interesting in different ways. You can still follow style, and you can still follow the money, but in some cases you're going to be talking about styles of historification and the money spent on that, right? Which gives me a headache just thinking about it.